Hello everyone, we are Team SpacePirates. We made an augmented reality multiplayer strategy game exploring novel AR control schemes and interactions. Here is our team. Our instructors are Ricardo and Ruth. So for this pitch project, we split our process into two phases. The first phase is prototyping phase, where we made multiple prototypes for our mechanics, like movement, combat, and setting up gameplay space. In our second phase, we focus on develop our game as a whole. So since after halves, we already have most of our MVP done. So we moved to adding features into our games. But then we realized we were too naive. So at the beginning of the semester, we thought we are going to make a full game to release. But that time we realized it's totally out of scope. So we decided to make a pivot in our game. Instead of making a market-ready game, we changed our plan. We cut down some features, and we focused on making a proof of concept with core gameplay, a simple network, and great user experience. Now, we have a fully working slice of game ready, and Alan is going to go through the live demo for you guys.
Thanks a lot, Menchie. So here we are going to set up the game with Richard and Pradnesh playing. Our game takes place on iOS devices using Apple's AR kit. The goal of the game is to become the richest pirate after 5 rounds. So every game of Space Pirates starts with you choosing your pirate faction. A faction is defined by a fleet of 3 spaceships that you see here. Richard is going through the different factions, and once he finds one he likes, he can choose it. Pradnesh has done the same, and now we can start our game. Once we're in the AR view, first both players need to scan the area so that the AR kit can get a map of the space, and then they need to scan the same marker token in order to sync their game to the same location. Our gameplay takes place over 2 different phases, the movement planning phase and the action phase. So let's get into the movement phase. But first, a little bit about the area you're seeing here. In the space, you see different asteroids floating around that are glittering with gold. These can be harvested for treasure. You also see different planets and space stations around the map. These are places where you can take cargo harvested from asteroids for additional treasure. In the space, you also see spaceships, both yours and your opponent's. You can tell which ships are yours by the outline of your UI around the border and the color of the beams down to the ground. There are also a few grids to show where the play space is. Now, when Richard hovers over one of his ships and presses the project course button, he projects both a movement cone and a ghost ship. The movement cone represents the 3-dimensional volume that your ship can move to. And the ghost ship represents the final position and orientation within that zone. Both players are plotting out their movement simultaneously and invisible from one another. And when they're ready, they can press the Finish Planning button to finalize their movement. So let's watch Richard's ships move now. The next phase of our gameplay is the action phase. In this phase, players take turns taking a single action with one of their ships. Richard goes first, and when he selects a ship, the actions available to that ship are highlighted. Since he's not close to an asteroid, he can't harvest, and since he's not close to a planet or space station, he can't sell any cargo. So let's see what the attack action looks like. When he takes the attack action with the ship, he enters the first-person point of view of that ship and gets a targeting reticle for his cannons. This red grid is his targeting zone, and when he aims within it, the reticle appears, and when he aims outside of it, it disappears, representing his inability to shoot there. So let's see him line up a shot over at one of Pradnesh's red ships and go for it. Now, After he takes his turn shooting, he presses the done button, and play passes to Pradnesh, and he gets to take an action. Now, Richard can still see in the AR view some of the things that Pradnesh would do. So when he looks over at the different fleet, oh, that's some rubble from a destroyed ship of Pradnesh's. So Richard can see the shields powered up on one of Pradnesh's spaceships, and play passes back over to Richard. So this ship is close to an asteroid, and he can take the harvest action to collect some loot. He gains a combination of ice and ore, which can be delivered to planets and space stations, and also raw treasure. Now, for the sake of time, we'll have to cut things short here, but the rest of this gameplay phase would see both players finishing out their 3 actions, and that would be a complete round. We'd go back to the movement planning phase and start another round anew. Thanks a lot. Now, here's Katul to talk about our playtest findings.
Thank you, Alan. So we have some interesting takeaways from this project that we believe would be helpful for future AR projects that explore this mobile space. So for positives, we have a couple. Moving around objects in 3D space using your phone is very rewarding and satisfying. The freedom that it provides is something that is super rewarding to all our playtesters, and we have integrated that learning into our movement phase. Shooting using your gyroscope in the phone, using the phone, is very intuitive. We have integrated that into our combat phase, and never once during our playtest did we have to tell our playtesters how to shoot at different ships. So this is something very interesting and very fun to do, and even so, combat was our most used action throughout all our playtests. For some issues that we encountered during playtests were, it is hard to get a sense of where the objects are in the play area because the players don't know how big the objects are and therefore cannot figure out how far they are. So we provided reference grids, as you see in the images behind me. There is a reference grid on the ground, as well as one at the height of the play area. So players can determine relative distances between multiple objects in the space. We also have logos and beams projecting down from ships. So players can easily find their own ships, as well as the enemy ships in the play area while playing the game, without hunting too much around for objects in the space. We also gave unique names to each and every ship based on their factions. These names are visible in the menu space as well as the AR view, so that players can easily find or point at what ships they are going to talk about or they're going to use. We also have other stats of the ships mentioned in AR view. As you can see, we can see the ice and the ore each ship has, so the players can plan their movement accordingly, whether to go to a space station or whether to go to a planet. Another thing, I already talked about that moving in 3D space is fun using your phone, but watch out. If you limit that movement in weird shapes, that's going to be a problem. We faced this problem in our movement phase with the cone. We iterated quite a bit on how much space to provide for the players to move in so that it's not frustrating and immersion breaking. We also had a lot of accidental button pressing during our playtest, so we moved less used buttons like finish planning to the top of the screen, which is a less accessible area. As we already had discussed our technical challenge, our major tech challenge was syncing up 2 AR spaces over network, and this was proving difficult using ARKit and Vuforia, mainly because of the amount of technical challenges they provided rather than the features that we would like to focus on building. So we dropped Vuforia entirely after halves, and we started using the new beta features of ARKit, which are image tracking and setting the world origin at a desired point. And the current marker that you see on the screen is what Richard and Pradnesh used to scan the space in the demo. And when the semester started, we wanted the game to be playable anywhere. So we did not want to go with a dedicated server. Instead, we went with one of the players' phone itself becoming the server. So currently, the game supports 2 to 4 players, and it does not require any dedicated server or internet. All you require is a local Wi-Fi. Now, I call Richard to talk more about our design process.
Thank you. So we had 2 designers on the team, so we had a lot of 2-person brainstorming sessions to come up with features and mechanics, and consulted with our programmers to check on feasibility before moving on to documentation. These included 1-page design sketches of individual features, a spreadsheet we used to balance all the factions against each other and export these values for the program, a UI mockup and wireframe document to clarify the flow of the app, and a style guide to make sure everything looked consistent. We didn't have time for an in-game tutorial, so instead we followed the example of modern board games and provided an instruction manual players could read through beforehand, as well as a player aid for quick reference in-game. And for those who want to dig deeper, a stat breakdown of all the ships in the fleets so people can plan out their strategies. At the pivot time, we had to drastically reduce the scope of what we'd planned. We had originally thought of having 12 different kinds of ships coming in 4 sizes, but many of these depended on individually used mechanics like boarding parties and harpoons and broadcasting. This was going to take a lot of programming. It was going to be really hard to balance against each other. Instead, we'd made just 6 ships, combined them into factions that each got 2 different kinds, so that we had 6 different to choose from. These all use the same 5 core mechanics, so they're a lot easier to balance against each other, and there's a lot less to create. Some lessons on efficient design we learned is that building mechanics for diversity is takes a lot of time, so it's better to use diversity of numerical spectrums instead. You should always discuss options with your programmers to make sure that you're choosing something that's going to be in scope. And paper prototypes are a really fast way to test balance. We also learned that flavor text is a really cheap way to inject theme and personality into your game. Here you can see a little bit of a breakdown of the iteration that some of our art went through. At the time of our MVP, everyone was using one kind of spaceship. From there, we did a 3D module layout to figure out exactly what was going to go on every ship and what was going to be pointed in what direction. We did some shape explorations, and then after the pivot, came back and went through again to come up with our final product. One thing we did that saved us a lot of time with art assets was that we used one single texture as an all-purpose thing for all the modules and ship components. This let us do the UV unwrapping as we went, and when it came time to do the final versions of the different factions and make them look different from each other, we could just paint over this one texture and know that everything was going to line up perfectly. Some things we learned about doing interface for AR. Don't make the player hunt around through the space to find an object. And anytime you do need them to find something, use colorful overlays to attract the attention against the background of the camera feed. Don't use 2D touch interfaces for controlling 3D movement, but instead use the actual position of a phone in 3D space. This is more intuitive. Don't make the player try to hold a position precisely in space. This is very difficult, whereas instead, aiming precisely with rotation is a fun challenge for most people. Now Pradesh will talk about production.
So during the semester, we faced a bunch of production issues that caused us to do a pivot and change our scope. Mainly, we didn't have a standardized naming convention and organization for our art assets and our code. That causes lots of issues when we're trying to integrate a bunch of stuff. Also, we didn't have a standard programming architecture, and that combined with 3 different programming styles and approaches made it really difficult to integrate things on the network. We should have focused more on integration testing rather than unit testing. And since the start, we should have put in placeholders for everything, including UI, text, sound, so that it is easier to change than to add towards the end. Also, we scoped this project with a big, unreasonable scope. We realized that digital games take a bunch of time to make compared to tabletop games. And we should have planned for network testing and contingencies much in advance rather than doing it later in the semester. Also, we used up 2 innovation tokens. One of them was making, converting a board game to AR and doing networking in AR. We probably should have chosen one and made the game around it. Also, there was a time when we had to cut down a bunch of features, which was a hard decision to make, but do not be afraid to do that. Going forward, none of us on the team are looking forward to create a startup from this game. We do plan to submit this game to a bunch of conferences and talk about what we learned and the technical challenges we faced. We are looking for potential companies to buy out this game idea and develop more, because we feel that with a longer schedule and a larger team, this could definitely be a marketable product. In all, we are Team SpacePirates. Thanks a lot for all our playtesters and faculty for giving us inputs while making this game in a really new technical background and challenge. And now we are open to questions. Yes?
Process question. You mentioned having 2 game designers, and in general, a lot of times, everyone sort of contributes to design, but there's a designer. How did you guys
So how did we parse out the role of having 2 game designers and still allow contributions from everyone? During our prototyping phase, we had a lot of group discussions where we went through lots of different possibilities and drew up lots of different sketches of things. Each programmer was able to choose something that they felt passionate about or interested in exploring. And as we moved more into the development phase and refining, we had a lot of our 2-person conversations, which would help us vet ideas before then bring it to the full group for input. Anything you want to add?
Yes.
Phone-based AR is a controversial genre. There's uncertainty about its long-term future. Do you have, now that you've spent time immersed in it, do you have thoughts about the long-term viability of AR phone games?
So what is the long-term viability of AR phone games? What we realize is that ARKit by itself is really stable, but it is much in beta. Like, it might take a few months of development to have all the features really reliable. But making games and letting people play anywhere would be a big plus. We think it's a really interesting medium because people enjoy doing physical things in the space with their phone. So building off that, there will definitely be some interesting applications in AR.
So currently you saw some takeaways that we had from our own project. So currently the space is very new, and further exploration would definitely provide some design constraints that people can build off of. Currently exploration is really difficult in this space, but if you have design ideas that you currently have in console games or PC games, if you have ideas of what will work and what won't work in this space, then we believe definitely this is a market that can go a long way.
So from your playtest, I saw you got people to move around. Did you get them to move up or down? Why or why not?
So currently we're not using, as you see, a lot of objects are in one space, but there are also objects up and down. And currently we're not restricting their play area to this flat space. We're leveraging all the spaces up and above the grid as well. So you can actually move down and target at other ships. You can point, currently they were moving in one space, but if you rotate your ship up and down, you can go in multiple directions and flow around in different interesting paths.
Were your players doing that?
Yes, so right now the ships have different directions they can shoot from and different shield directions. So that creates a strategy where people can move around their ship in different rotations. And if the ship can only shoot from the front, going above and aiming down, like some people tried to do that. So trying to play up and down was one thing we definitely saw people do.
All right, that's time.
Thank you.